Hi, I am River Lightbearer from River Evolutions, channeling, coaching, and healing, or whatever order those services go in nowadays. Um, I got into doing things like channeling and energy healing because I am a trauma survivor. I have dealt with various forms of bullying, abuse, um, really difficult experiences in my life. And those have left a long term impact on me. I learned energy healing and channeling because those were tools that somebody else used to help me deal with the traumas that I'd experienced. And they made a really profound difference for me. So I wanted to learn them so that I could share them with others and use them to help other people in their own trauma healing journeys. But the one thing that I've found as a trauma survivor is that sometimes when I try to access a service like coaching or healing or even readings, sometimes practitioners don't always understand how trauma has impacted my ability to comprehend certain things, my ability to allow people to touch me. And so, one of the things that I'm doing now through River Evolutions is offering consultation to spiritually based practitioners who want to learn ways to make their practices more accessible to trauma survivors. Now, as a practitioner or a coach or whatever it is that you do in the world, you may not be aware of how many of your clients have trauma histories or if any of them do. But many people have experienced some form of trauma in their lives. And the thing is, trauma doesn't refer to the event as much as it refers to the effect the event has or the ongoing stream of events in some cases. When a, a traumatic event occurs, your brain kicks into automatic gear. Your brain will, you fall into fight, flight, or freeze mode, and you don't consciously decide at the time that a threat is presented. You don't consciously decide, oh, I'm going to run away. No, I'm going to fight back. No, I'm just going to stand here frozen. It's not a conscious decision, it's an automatic decision that's made in a deeper part of your brain that operates automatically, autonomically. When you experience trauma, and especially when it is long term ongoing, as in the case of abuse, the parts of your brain that are responsible for um, interpreting something as threatening and responding to that threat kind of go haywire. Now, I'm not explaining this in scientific terms because I am not a scientist, I am not an expert, I am not a licensed professional, and I want to be very clear I'm not trying to present myself as one. But I have done a lot of study and research on this because it helps me understand myself better and also helps me be better able to help clients. So, trauma, again, especially when it's long term and ongoing, it changes how your brain functions. And those changes to your brain have a huge, wide ranging impact on your entire life. Some people think that trauma is just a feeling and you can choose not to feel that way, and that's not how it works, because the actual structure of your brain and the actual function of your brain is changed just as much as if you suffered a brain injury. In fact, in some ways, trauma might be considered a brain injury. It's just that you're not necessarily being physically injured, but it's still, it changes the way that certain parts of your brain work, or whether they work at all. And those changes affect communication. People who live with PTSD, for example, might have trouble putting words together, especially at times of heightened emotion. You'll notice that there are times when I'm stopping and pausing and sometimes rewinding a word or two. And that's because I want to make sure that I'm really clear on what I'm saying here. But part of my trauma history involves being abused for lying when I didn't say things clearly enough. So one of the very long-term effects that my trauma has had on me is that I tend to over-explain things, but I also tend to feel very anxious when I'm trying to explain things, which means that sometimes the words that I need are not there. And sometimes that causes me to feel more anxious, which means the words are even harder to access. And I'm leaving those gaps and those verbal rewinds in deliberately because, first of all, it's who I am and it's how I talk. But also because it is an illustration of part of what I'm talking about in this video. It is not, I don't choose to over explain things. I don't choose to verbally rewind. It's a trauma thing. Because the trauma that I experienced affected the communication center of my brain, among other things. Now, this is something that I'm aware of, and so it's something that I can manage. But it is not something that I have full control over, and it's not something that I consciously choose. I don't choose to have difficulty with verbal communication. I choose to learn how to manage it and work with it. But the actual issue isn't a choice. People with trauma histories often have a lot of difficulty connecting with other people, because when you experience abuse, you learn, first of all, not to trust other people, which impacts your ability to connect. But also, some of the brain functions that are necessary to form those connections are affected by the trauma. People with trauma histories often have a really hard time with nonverbal language cues. And you have to really connect with somebody, you need to be able to read the body language and the facial expression as much as interpreting their words. People who have a trauma history may struggle with having somebody in authority over them. That's one of my big things. I get so tense and anxious if I feel like somebody has authority over me. And that's impacted my ability to engage in a coaching situation, because even though intellectually I know I am working with this coach, we are on a level playing field. Yes, she has more knowledge than I do, but we're equals. I know that on an intellectual level, but part of my brain that has been affected by the trauma reads it as, this person is authority over me, and so I have to do what she says because she's in charge, and if I can't do what she says, she might get mad at me. So that's why I don't currently work with a business coach, because this is an issue with my brain that I need to address and work with in a therapeutic relationship, and I am in therapy. before I'm able to actually access the coaching. I'm not going to go through all of the effects that trauma can have on somebody right now in this video, because this would make it a really, really long video. And one of the things that I want everyone to remember is that trauma does not affect everybody the same way. So I'm telling you what is generally true, and I'm telling you what is true for me, but that doesn't mean that it's true for everybody who has experienced trauma. It is true that everybody who has experienced trauma has experienced alterations in their brain structure and function, because that's what trauma means. But what those effects are, what those alterations are, and how they impact somebody's day-to-day life and their functioning can vary from person to person. What traumatizes somebody varies from person to person. Two people could experience exactly the same incident, and for one person it's horribly traumatic, and for the other person it's a minor inconvenience. There are a lot of different variables that go into how an event affects somebody and whether it does cause those trauma effects. So, not every incident that appears traumatic is going to traumatize everybody who experiences the incident. And not everybody who experiences trauma is going to be impacted by it in the same way. And I'm saying that because I know coaches and practitioners who are also trauma survivors, who, when I say I'm a trauma survivor and here's what I need to work with that and here's what I live with because of that, tell me that I'm wrong, because that's not their experience. And I'm sorry, but no matter who you are, you don't get to tell another person that they are wrong about their personal experience. Trauma survivors don't all have the same experiences or the same impacts. And so it's important to remember, as a practitioner or a coach, that even if you yourself are a trauma survivor, not all of your clients who are trauma survivors are going to have the same experiences and the same after effects that you have. So if you are working with somebody and you know that they're a trauma survivor and they tell you, for example, I have a hard time understanding when people explain things to me, would you be willing to explain things differently so that I can understand? If you say to them, I'm not going to take the time to explain it differently, either understand it or not, you're just using trauma as an excuse, then you are not serving that person in the slightest. I'm not saying that a practitioner or a coach needs to change everything they do to accommodate a trauma survivor, because ultimately it is up to the survivor to understand their needs and understand how to manage them. But at the same time, if you're not willing to make modifications when a survivor says, here's an effect that I have and here is how I manage it, will you work with me to manage this? Like, they're not asking you to manage it for them. They're telling you, one of the ways I manage it is by doing this, and so I am asking if you're willing to do this with me. If you're not willing, be upfront about that. But don't tell them that they're wrong, and don't tell them that they're, throwing off their responsibility, because that's not what's happening. It takes a lot of courage for some trauma survivors to advocate for themselves in the first place, because depending on the nature of the trauma, they may have learned that advocating for themselves is dangerous as hell. And so if they're even able to speak up and say, here's something that I need from you, if you're telling them that asking for that is abandoning their responsibility, you're causing further damage. You're causing further harm to them. Again, I'm not saying that all coaches and practitioners should bend over backwards to do everything to accommodate trauma survivors. If you don't want to, that's fine. But be upfront about that. If somebody comes to you and says, I'm a trauma survivor, and you're not willing to make any accommodations, tell them that so that they know what they're getting into if they choose to work with you. But I would recommend being open to the idea of making some accommodations. If if a survivor comes to you and says, if you phrase things like do this, do that, I feel like I have no choice and that causes me to feel trapped and triggered. Does it really cause you harm or cost you time to change your phrasing? For example, instead of saying do this, say, have you considered doing this? Or would it be easier for you to do this or this? And again, this is a thing that's true for me personally. If somebody tells me do this, I feel like I have no choice. I have to do it or else. And sometimes the things that I'm being told to do are things that I'm either not capable of doing or things that are very difficult or frightening for me to do. And then that causes further anxiety because, again, this kicks into the part of my brain that says, but they're in charge, and if I don't do what they said, they might hurt me. Intellectually, I recognize that that is irrational. Intellect, rationality, and deeper trauma affected parts don't always play nice together. So for me, if somebody says, do this, it's a problem for me. It causes issues for me, and I can usually work through it because I have put in a lot of work to learn how to manage these reactions. But it's a lot easier for me if somebody says, would you consider this instead of do this? Or if they give me options instead of telling me to do one specific thing. Some of the coaches and practitioners I have encountered are unwilling to make that change, and that's their choice. I'm not going to tell anybody that they don't have a choice, but it does mean that they're not people that I'm inclined to work with further because their way of working is not a fit for my way or for what I need to be able to access the service. So what I would really like you to take away from this video, quick sum up here. Trauma causes long-lasting, sometimes permanent effects to the brain, to the mind. Brain is the physical structure, mind is what it does, I guess. To the body. Trauma has long-term effects on the body. That there are studies showing that autoimmune disorders are a direct result of trauma, and it causes effects to the energy. These effects are long-lasting. Some of them are permanent, and they are not the choice of the survivor. Trauma is not just getting stuck in the past or thinking bad thoughts. It's an actual physiological change in functioning. If you work with trauma survivors and they ask you for help in managing their thing, if they say, I'd really love to work with you, I notice that you do this way, could I do it that way instead? And you say, no, because you just want me to manage your thing, take responsibility, that's harmful. You don't have to change how you do things, but it's helpful if you're open to the possibility of doing so if you're asked. And not everybody who experiences trauma experiences in the same way, has the same effects, and even the same event will not impact two people exactly the same. So even if you are yourself a trauma survivor, the way that you experience it and manage it might not be true and might not work for everybody. So, there are ways that are fairly simple to alter certain practices to make them more accessible to trauma survivors, to be more trauma sensitive. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those in a video in a couple of weeks, because this video is getting really long already. Because this is a really long, in-depth topic. There's no quick and easy way to talk about trauma and its effects and how to benefit trauma survivors in your work and how to benefit yourself in working with trauma survivors, including if you are one. So I will be back in a couple of weeks and talk a little bit more about, you know, talk a little bit more about some changes that you might make in your practice if you are willing to do so, that might be beneficial to trauma survivors. And if you have any questions or any thoughts, any experiences that you want to share, leave a comment below. If you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to the channel. And I will see you in a couple of weeks. Take care.